Perfect.
Okay, I think you're good to go, Danielle.
Excellent. Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the third and final workshop to develop a new floating kelp indicator for Washington State. My name is Danielle Claire, and on behalf of the whole project team, we really want to thank you for taking part in this project. Many of you have given us a lot of input multiple times over the past year. We really appreciate it, and you'll see that a lot of it has been incorporated into this version of the indicator. Today, we'll introduce you to the first edition of the indicator. And as you may know, we're a diverse project team with representatives from the Samish Indian Nation, Marine Agronomics, the Northwest Straits Commission, the University of Washington, Sea Grant Washington, and the Washington Department of Natural Resources. Each of our project team members will introduce themselves in the Etherpad, which I will cover in just a moment, so you can see who is part of that team. And this version of the indicator is the last step in the development process, but it's really just the first step towards building and using the floating kelp indicator data in Washington State. Next slide, please. So here's today's agenda. First, we'll start with some context. Why is kelp important? And we'll talk about the project schedule and how this fits into the context of the larger project. The remainder of the workshop is divided into 3 sections with time for questions and discussion after each section. First, we'll introduce you to the indicator. We'll talk about definition, findings, and products. Secondly, we'll discuss community engagement, what we've already done and what we hope to do in the future. And third, we will brainstorm about the priorities for enhancement. So talking about things that we may add to the indicator moving into the future. And finally, we'll wrap up by noon. Next slide, please. Today we'll be using Etherpad for comments and questions. So Julia, if you can put the link to Etherpad in the chat, thank you. Etherpad is similar to Google Docs. You can place the cursor wherever you want and go. And it's anonymous unless you prefer to name yourself. So if you want to name yourself, you can go up to the upper right-hand corner and the little picture of the people. You can click on that and go ahead and type your name in. If you like something you see, go ahead and add a plus or a comment regarding whatever that other comment is. And this just helps us organize content and keep things in the same place. So just try to refer back to that if you have comments to make. And then I'd like to ask each of you to go ahead and please introduce yourself in the Etherpad. There's a section for that at the top where you can type your name, as well as any other highlights and your connection to this project or kelp research in general. Next slide, please. We'll start by briefly remembering why we're here. Kelp is a pillar of our ecosystem. Its role can be summarized in 2 huge buckets. First, it provides critical habitat, a place to live for many, many different organisms. Secondly, it produces primary production that fuels the food web. In these ways, kelp connects many organisms, including forage fish in the background photo by Florian Grainer, salmon who use kelp as migration corridors, refugia and hunting grounds, orcas, and next, and rockfish. Next slide, please. Kelp is also a cultural pillar. It was a migration corridor for early people, and it's a place to fish, shown by these maps by Samish fishermen up in the top left. And it's a food source that's important to many people, both the kelp itself and the things that live on and around it. It's an integral component of our stories and art, and it's what makes the Washington coast quintessentially the Washington coast. Next slide, please. Floating kelp canopy indicator development project is split up into 3 phases. First, at the beginning of 2022, we identified the indicator requirements. And secondly, we explored indicator options. You all gave us a lot of feedback in phase 2, and you'll see that it's incorporated into this version. And in phase 3, we're finalizing the indicator. We released draft products on December 20th. Julia, if you can share the link to the graphical abstract. At that graphical abstract, you can actually click through to see those different draft products. Excuse me. And in this workshop, we'll go ahead and introduce you to each of those products. Comments on this version of the indicator are due on March 15th. And we'll be integrating any comments that we can into this first edition of the indicator, which is due to the partnership in May 2023. But any large comments or additional significant changes, we will incorporate into our priorities for future work. So now for some fun, for your morning excitement, Tom Mumford is going to tell you about a raffle and a prize.
Good morning, everybody. Hear me, I hope. This is Tom, and really, I'm glad everybody's here. In order to keep you here, we have a time-honored tradition here in these workshops, and that is to have a raffle. This is called the enticement. So what I've done is, it's a little different basket than the picture, but here's a kelp basket, and in that are everybody's names on a little slip of paper that have registered. And so what I'm going to do is, you're all going to sit and be very attentive, and at the end of the presentation, at the end of the workshop, I should say, I'm going to make the drawing, and what you're going to get is a 16 by 20 inch photograph framed of bull kelp by our very own Tim McClure, and also, if you want to take a look at his underwater photography, it's gorgeous. So that's what we're going to do, so hang tight, and see you at the end.
All right, thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone. I'm Wendell Raymond. I'm on the project team. I'm going to bring you through some of our presentation today. A quick note on the Etherpad. Thank you, everybody, for getting in there and putting your name. There's headings, bolded headings for each section of our presentation today. And so we're about to start the Meet the Indicator section. So as you have comments or questions that you'd like to type, please type them under that heading as we get going. Thanks. And thanks a lot for working with this format. All right, so let's jump in and meet the indicator. Next slide. So today's presentation draws from the draft documents that are out for review. And you can access these products through the graphical abstract, which we just linked in the chat. But a link to the graphical abstract is also at the very top of the Etherpad, along with links to other products. So to start, we're going to focus on the central products of the indicator, which are in the brown box in the middle. Next slide. So these products fall into two broad categories. First are the preliminary results, including the statewide summary report and an interactive map, which we're going to dig into more later. And then second are supporting documents, which hold more detail. These are the program design and data assessment protocols report and a draft example subbasin report. Next slide. So some of you might be saying, wait, where's Puget Sound info? Well, it's here. It's Appendix B in the statewide summary report. So the draft content that will eventually go on Puget Sound vital signs is in Appendix B. Next slide. All right, so the indicator development project has been guided by these key considerations, which were first introduced a year ago when this project started. These have been refined by the project team and by input from workshop participants and others. So in this final stage of the project, we've done our best to address these considerations in the final indicator that we're presenting today. And one of the hopes for this workshop is to present the draft indicator and highlight aspects that reflect these key considerations. And I'll point out that a lot more detail on these considerations and how they're used in the indicator can be found in the Monitoring Program Design and Data Assessment Protocols report. Next slide. So what is the indicator anyway? So the indicator tracks the portion of kelp forest that floats on the surface, like this awesome picture shows. So programs throughout the world monitor the extent of kelp forests floating at the surface. And here in Washington, two species form extensive surface canopies, bull kelp and giant kelp. Next slide. kelp forest bed area is the primary statewide metric, defined as the area of floating kelp tissues and the gaps in between. So in this near infrared image on the slide, bed area of this particular kelp forest is outlined in yellow. We also use secondary metrics like kelp canopy area whenever data is available. And canopy area is defined as just the floating kelp tissue itself, shown in red on the image. And we should note that canopy area and bed area are generally very well correlated. We decided to use bed area for the statewide metric because it's the most data rich, meaning that we have bed area monitoring data from the most locations throughout the state. Next slide. All right, so how does the indicator work in practice? So the indicator assesses long-term trends in kelp bed area at 172 locations. So trends are assessed using simple linear regression over the entire data record available for a given location. We also assess trends on a more recent scale defined as the last 5 years, but due to high year-to-year variability, the indicator emphasizes long-term trends. So results from this regression analysis help place a particular location in one of 6 trend categories shown on the left of the slide. Increasing, no trend, and decreasing are directly pulled from regression results, where increasing is a significant positive relationship, decreasing significant negative, and no trend is no significant change in bed area over time. The other categories include total loss. This is a situation where kelp has been present at a location, but is not present in the most recent year. Limited data, which is a situation where we may have quantitative data for that location, but it's not suitable for regression analysis for a variety of reasons. And then finally, no floating kelp. This is when surveys have never recorded floating kelp in that particular area. Next slide. So we can look at trends at locations on a map, or we can summarize the percent of locations in each trend category to better understand broad patterns. So we have summarized trends within 11 subbasins, and these subbasins are commonly used oceanographic units that are generally familiar to many people. And these subbasins were defined following the subbasins developed by PSEMP, as well as consultation with the project team, these various workshops that we've had, but also considering kelp ecology and broad geomorphology. We also chose to expand the classification in order to distinguish 2 radically different nearshore systems on the outer coast, the rocky, high energy exposed shorelines of the northern outer coast, and the more sandy, large river estuarine systems on the southern coast. So looking at this plot on the slide, for example, the northern coast outlined in the green box is dominated by locations with increasing or no trend in bed area. So there's a lot of dark and light green in that stacked bar. In contrast, South Puget Sound, outlined in the red box, is dominated by locations with declines and total losses. So a lot of pink and red in that stacked bar. Now we understand that this is a lot of data and it takes some time to digest it. And one very strong message that we've heard throughout the project is that we need a summary that is intuitive and rapidly understandable. So let's take a look at that. Next slide. So subbasin status provides a rapid summary of the state of knowledge of floating kelp within a subbasin. So in general, floating kelp status is assessed at the subbasin scale, again, in these commonly used oceanographic units. And to give you an example of how this can work in practice, Elizabeth Spalding on the project team, who is a member of the Habitat Implementation Strategic Lead, can use subbasin status to identify areas where kelp is most vulnerable and the most need of recovery and conservation. Subbasin status could also be useful in a research context to focus stressor research in certain nearshore areas. We do want to point out that status is often assessed relative to a baseline or a target. Floating kelp doesn't have either of those metrics yet. So we define status based on considering trends in the resource, as well as other quantitative and qualitative data that's available in that subbasin, along with our understanding of data certainty. So to run through our results that we have now and the categories. First is stable, the green areas. This is the northern coast, eastern and western Strait of Juan de Fuca. Next, in the yellowy orange, is concern of decline in the Saratoga and Whidbey basins and the San Juan Islands. Next, in red, substantial evidence of decline in South Puget Sound and Central Puget Sound. And then insufficient data in Admiralty Inlet and North Puget Sound. And in this case, we do have quantitative location level data in North Puget Sound and Admiralty Inlet, but we only have a few sites. So this precludes definitive assessment. And then finally, no floating kelp in the southern coast and Hood Canal. And we want you to notice that there's really stark differences in our assessments of subbasins. They sort of span the whole range here across the state. Next slide. So there's some important context to consider when looking at our results, highlighted by this table, and that's that data completeness and coverage is not even across subbasins. And this has implications for comparing results among the subbasins. So this table shows the number of locations monitored and the approximate percent of the nearshore extent that's monitored in a given subbasin. So for example, Admiralty Inlet only has 2 monitoring locations, which cover only about 1% of the nearshore habitat. On the other end of the spectrum is the Western Strait of Juan de Fuca, which has 23 locations monitored, covering the entire nearshore area. Next slide. So another way to look at this data completeness issue is with this plot, which shows how many years of data we have at a given location across our different subbasins. And the size of the circles on this plot is relative to the number of locations. So the data that we've been using for this iteration of the indicator comes in 2 forms. Either we have many sites with over 30 years of data, so the right-hand side of the plot, or we have a few sites with 10 years of data on the left-hand side of the plot. The exception to this is our sites in the San Juans, where we have a lot of locations with 3 years of data. However, data limitations preclude regression analysis of these data, and this is part of the reason, along with indigenous scientific knowledge and other observations from the San Juan Islands, which leads us to the concern of declines status that I mentioned earlier. Next slide. And I'll pass it off to Helen to talk more about the interactive map.
Hi, everyone. I'm Helen Berry. I work for DNR, part of the project team. And I'd like to say right before I start this section is keep adding questions and comments to Etherpad. We're going to get to a question and discussion section next. I'm going to talk about the interactive map. And originally we had planned map development for some future phase, but we revised this plan when we realized that we needed an interactive map. It's an essential tool for exploring the findings. So you'll find a link to the interactive map in the graphical abstract. And if everyone fires up the map right now, it would make for a very interesting stress test. So if you do that, we'll see what happens. I'll give a brief demo right now. And by the way, I'm already getting a lot of great comments on how to further develop the map. So we'll start implementing them tomorrow. Next slide. When you first enter the site, and this is just a basic browser-based map like Google Maps, you'll see a splash screen, which provides some summary instructions. If you're like most people, including almost the entire project team, you'll immediately click OK, and the screen will disappear, and then you'll realize you really wanted to read those instructions. So you can get to the instructions later by using the information button, and I'll show you that later in this demo. Okay, next slide. So when the map opens, you'll see this statewide view, and you'll see the subbasin polygons that Wendell just went over, color-coded by status. Next slide. And there's the legend on the right-hand side. You will also see next all of the points, which are the long-term transit locations. And one of the great things about this map is you can explore these different levels of data. And you can see, and we'll zoom in and I'll show you how. So as Wendell discussed, the points show these long-term trends according to the classification at locations. And to explore, what you'll do is zoom in with your cursor. Next slide. So you can zoom in and out. And when you zoom into about here, you can click on a subbasin polygon to get details. Go ahead, Elizabeth, next. And then what you see here is a little window that lets you know, oh, this is the Eastern Strait of Juan de Fuca, and it's classified as stable. And you can also see a little thumbnail, which includes all of the different percentages of monitoring locations in different trend categories. Well, here's the trick. Click on the thumbnail if you want to know more. So next slide. If you click on that thumbnail, you'll get a one-page subbasin summary. And you can see there's a location map on the left. There are bullets that list the key findings and describe why we've classified that subbasin the way we have. There are bar charts in the lower left-hand corners with both the long-term trends and the short-term trends in terms of percentages of monitoring locations that fall into each category. And finally, if you love numbers, you might prefer the lower right-hand corner, which will give you information on how many locations are monitored there, what percentage of the total nearshore area in the subbasin is monitored, and then also our rough estimate of how much of the floating kelp in the state occurs within that subbasin. So, so that's really cool. And again, this is our goal to allow you to drill into the data so you can see what color the subbasin is, and then you can choose to get more information on this page. And then if you want, you can go up to the in-depth documents, which will give you even more information, which are links on the upper right-hand side. Okay, so let's go back to the map. So go ahead and zoom in a different way by zooming into the map. And what you'll see is the subbasin polygons disappear. And instead you'll get, next, you'll get a change in the legend. And instead you'll see gray polygons, which show the boundaries of each monitoring location. And remember, this isn't a comprehensive map. This is just 172 monitoring locations. So, and one comment I've gotten that we'll do is we'll beef up how visible those gray polygons are, so they're really easy for people to see. Another thing you'll see is the blue polygons, which show maximum cumulative extent of floating kelp in all of the years in this monitoring data set. And on top of that, you'll see yellow polygons that show the bed extent during the most recent year of monitoring. So let's say you want more information on these sites. Go ahead and click on any of the points. And I just clicked on one. Next slide. Yeah. And what you'll see is that this is Eby's Landing, and we have 7 years of data. And during that time, this site has been increasing. And you can also see a little thumbnail that gives you the bed area in every year that the site was sampled, that we have monitoring data. If you click on that little thumbnail, go ahead and next slide, you'll get a one-page summary of the site, of the monitoring location. So here you can see, this is a really interesting monitoring location that's monitored by the Island County MRC. And you have links to the MRC and the Northwest Straits Commission in the upper right-hand corner. So you can go to that data source and get more information. You also see a quick narrative that lets you know how the site is doing and what they have found. Again, bed area in the upper left, so you can actually see how bed area has changed over the years that they've been monitoring. Lower left hand is, in the lower left hand, you'll find a map that shows the footprint of the bed in each of the monitoring years, and also a link to Sound IQ, which allows you to explore the data in more detail. And then finally, a great picture of a volunteer that gives you a sense of the site. And by the way, the format of these one-page summaries, it varies by data set. So these are very customized for the MRC work. So next slide. one last note, there are icons you'll find in the upper right-hand corner. These are widgets. So the information button, which is the far right eye that you're all familiar with, it provides links to the document, other documents that are coming out of the monitoring program, and to the instructions that you blew through in the splash screen, and that we all blow through, really. The next widget is a base map widget. So if you prefer a different base map, like I prefer oceans, you can go to the base map widget and change it to anything you want. The next widget, which is like a little stack of squares, is it allows you to turn layers on and off. And if you're a more advanced user, you know who you are and you know that you want to do this probably. And we will continue to add layers that people would find useful to this section. And then finally, next slide, this icon will get you back to the legend. So when you have explored those other widgets and you want to see the legend again, press that one. So that's your quick introduction to the interactive map. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth, next slide, for questions on and discussion of everything we've heard in the last 15 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to pop us into full group mode because we do want to entertain questions both through raised hands as well as questions that have been submitted on the Etherpad. And just so everyone knows, we probably won't have time to get to all of the questions today, which is why we're encouraging you to send them to the Etherpad so that we have documentation and we can follow up on them. And we also really want to make sure that we get a diversity of questions, both in content and from different perspectives. So this is just a little bit of a quick hit, and then we will keep moving. So let's go ahead and start with raised hands. Does anyone have a question based on this initial information that we've shared with regard to the indicator? And if you're new to Zoom, which I find that hard to believe, but if so, you can find the raised hand button here at the bottom under reactions.
So Elizabeth, I can jump in while people are still thinking and answer one of the questions that's in Etherpad.
Perfect.
And people can feel free to add their questions to Etherpad. The point that I think H made, I don't know who that is Puget Sound is an inland sea. Would you consider upland use activities as a potential indicator? And we'll talk about, this is a great question. We will talk about, I would talk about upland use activities as a potential stressor that might be changing kelp dynamics. And one of the tricky things about this long-term monitoring is we link to work on stressors and other indicators, but that will be peripheral to the monitoring work itself. The partnership has a whole suite of indicators, and someone at the partnership might be able to answer this question better. I think they call them, they don't use the word for human drivers, they have a different word. It's not an indicator, is it an intermediate outcome? Maybe it's a driver. Anyway, we're working in that larger partnership context, and so they would be the ones to decide if that's an indicator. We definitely think about that when we interpret the kelp data, and we work with groups such as UW, Western Washington, to try to understand through research what the main stressors are. So, one last thing I'd just like to say as a plug for Puget Sound. Puget Sound is much more impacted, as we all know, by terrestrial elements than the outer coast. And so, it is an inland sea. And so we think very hard about those terrestrial influences.
Thank you, Helen. So we are open for questions. If you want to raise your hand and voice one, we can also continue to pull questions from the Etherpad. But feel free to raise your hand. Clyde.
I put this on the Etherpad, but I'll just raise it here. I saw sort of the total loss around Protection Island. It's sort of an anomaly on the eastern Strait of Juan de Fuca, and I wonder why. There was no mention in the there was no speculation in the discussion section of the document. So I thought that maybe somebody had some insights there. So that's my question.
I would love to take that question, Clyde. And I know this is something that Tom Mumford and I have been thinking about since the early 2000s. And I'll start with an answer, and then that'd be great for other people to jump in. If you look at the map, those of you who are in the interactive map, you'll see that, and if you look at the narrative we've written on the one-page summary, the eastern Strait of Juan de Fuca is a fascinating place because most of the areas are either stable or increasing in the time record that we have. However, there's this pocket of loss. And it happens in the areas we've monitored around Miller Peninsula, Protection Island. Someone on the project team could pull up share the interactive map and show this so everyone can see it. I'm not going to do it because I'm going to keep talking. But there's this pocket of loss, and actually Clyde lives near one of those pockets. There's the Dallas Bank on the north side of Protection Island. There's Miller Peninsula, and then there's Cape George, and perhaps there's some areas just east of McCurdy Point that other residents have noted. Jeff Taylor, who might be here. We have done underwater video analyses of the Dallas Bank, so Protection Island, and what we see there is a really diverse, dense kelp community. So the question there is, why have we lost the bull kelp? There are many other species of kelp and other vegetation there, including seagrasses and eelgrass. So that place we're less concerned. It could be more related to competition. There we go. This is a great part of the interactive map, folks. So you can look and see, if you look at Dallas Bank, you can see it's all blue. There's no yellow left there anymore. And you can see also Miller Peninsula to the south. It's almost all blue. There are little bits of yellow. And then later, I'm going to mention Cape George, which is to the south, and it's outside of our monitoring area. The local residents there have noted that they have very low density floating kelp there, and it's less than their memories of the floating kelp density at those sites. So while we generally feel good about calling Eastern Strait of Juan de Fuca stable, you will see in all of our assessments that we call out this particular region as a region of concern within an otherwise healthy region. And by the way, one of the reasons we like looking at monitoring locations is if you look at just the total area for the floating kelp beds in this view right now, the total abundance doesn't change, it's stable. However, because these areas have pretty small amounts of floating kelp in them where they were lost. However, we do have a really important spatial pattern here that we'd like to understand. I'll stop there. Who wants to add something else on this great topic?
This is Tom. I'll just add a few comments here. This is the interesting dynamic between the floating kelp and the subtidal non-floating kelp, the two species versus the 20 some odd other species that we've got here. Helen's group is starting to work on the dynamics of the subtidal kelp. The other thing to note here is that some years ago, I think it was in the 80s, wasn't it, Helen? There was a massive amount of sea urchin commercial harvesting that took place in this area. And so the urchin kelp dynamics is one that now people are beginning to really appreciate, is really important and might have something to do with what happened here, but it's going to be hard to unravel that.
Any other responses from the project team before we move to the next question? Okay. Lynn, I see your hand up. Let's take a question from you.
Yeah. So I'm a Skagit MRC and project lead we have 3 areas that we monitor in the Skagit area. We span 2 of your subbasins. One of them is the North NPS. I wrote down the acronym. I can't remember what it stands for, but insufficient data. How do we fix that? Do we need to identify more kelp beds to monitor so that we have more shoreline that we have data for? And if so, how do we make those decisions? How do we pick the right kelp bed areas? We have a lot more kelp around here. We're just not monitoring it. So how do we fix that?
It would be great if whoever did it before would show the interactive map for North Puget Sound. We have about, and we could actually zoom in to, and I could fire it up too, if, but so we can look at the exact numbers for North Puget Sound. I think we only may have 2 monitoring locations there. It's like somewhere around 1% of the, yeah, and if you could zoom out, Julia, and we could look at the subbasin summary, that'd be great. So yeah, in North Puget Sound, we called it insufficient data. Let's look at why. It's, I'm looking at the bottom, we have actually, is that 8 sites? And it's about 3% of the nearshore habitat. I'm on a really small screen, so it's hard for me to read anything. And note that the sites that we do have there, we don't have really long-term data records for. So we will talk later about major enhancements that are needed. But in a nutshell, our subbasin status summaries highlight that we desperately need more information in North Puget Sound. We don't have the funding to go beyond this 172 sites at this point, but we are on an ongoing long-term basis, but we are doing some experimental studies. So we'll talk later about the fact that we collected aerial photography, low tide, aerial photography for the whole area in 2022. So that will give us our first snapshot of floating kelp throughout that area. And then we'll have to see about how we can find the funding to continue to monitor that. Now that's the DNR side. We work with aerial photography and drone photography. We would love it for the MRCs to also pick up more monitoring sites. And that I know that you know, Dana, or I don't know if Allie's here, could jump in, and their next meeting is in January. So so that's a, you know, an active part that the MRCs and the Northwest Straits Commission can work on.
And Allie,
The one
I know
distinction, oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I know Allie's in the room, but if she has anything she wants to add maybe on that piece.
I think this is actually a really great thing that we can talk about during the meetings. I know Julia will be talking about this data as well, and we have about 30 minutes of just open discussion. So this would be a great thing that we can bring back. So yeah, Lynn, thank you for bringing.
Thanks, Allie. Helen, anything else you wanted to add with regard to that question?
We'll be talking a lot about data sources, both narrowly defined ones like the ones we use in the monitoring locations, and broader types of knowledge later in these talks. So so stay tuned for more on that. And I'd also like to point out that there are a lot of people here who want to get involved. And so, for instance, Robin Codner and her students are here from Western Washington Marine Conservation course. And so there's one set of enthusiastic people who have some time. And then the MRCs are another immediate place people could go. And then finally, let's think about that more during the community engagement sections and the major enhancements that are needed sections, which are the next 2 sections of these presentations.
Great. So we do have about 5 more minutes for questions on this particular section. So feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, we can pull a question from the Etherpad. But you'll note that we are actually responding in real time to some of those questions. Okay, Helen and Wendell, any questions that you haven't responded to yet that you feel like would be a really good segue into our next section, or anything that you'd like to address now?
So I'd like to address one more question that comes up a lot, which is I've gotten this question many emails, and it just came up on the Etherpad. It's really important. People are asking, Is this map intended only for showing trends? And there are large areas of bull kelp that are not shown. That is true. This is a long-term monitoring indicator, and it's at 172 sites. And so that is the scope of this project. Of course, many of us in this room are interested in knowing about floating kelp in other areas, including me. And we have other projects and tools that we use, but that is the scope of this project right here, is long-term trends. And right now the interactive map is only 172 sites, which, by the way, may seem like very little, but as you know, we pulled this monitoring indicator together very quickly with existing data. 172 is a really great number. So you can look at it both ways, and I do. Like, I feel like it's very incomplete, but then I also feel like that's a really good start.
Any last questions? We still have a few minutes left for one last question.
Elizabeth, maybe I can just weigh in and pony off of what Helen just said on that. And I think that's a really important recurring theme that we're trying to emphasize throughout the rollout of this, is that this is a starting point. It's based on available data that we could get together. We know that there's other casual observations out there. We certainly view this, as the local MRC person mentioned, as a great way to identify data gaps. And the hope is that there'll be future iterations that become more and more complete of this in the future. And so, you know, this is our starting point, working with the partnership to develop this indicator. It is by no means an end point as far as the kelp recovery community goes.
Great, thank you, Todd.
So there was a great question in the Zoom chat, which is getting moved to the Etherpad, but I can address it and talk about it. How many years determine long-term trends? Yeah, excellent question. So when we are talking about long-term trends at the 172 locations, that's specific to the location that we're talking about. So some locations have 30 plus years of data, and so we look at that entire data record. Other locations may only have 10 or 7. The minimum amount for this first iteration is 5 years. And so this is an important aspect of the data and how we compare trends and the results from location to location, because one location may only have 5 years of data, but another location has 30 years of data. So when you're like looking around the interactive map and you're looking at graphs, that can be an important thing to check on, is, well, how long is that entire data record? So at a minimum, it's 5 years, but it could be up to 30 plus.
Great. Any last comments in the last 2 minutes before break from our project team? Anything else you'd like to weigh in on?
I'd like to follow up on what Wendell said. And Julia, could you show the interactive map and zero in on the San Juans? Because the San Juans is a great example of the challenges of this work. Basically, as you may remember from Wendell's presentation, that the San Juans we have data from almost everywhere. You can see that those little gray circles, all the points are gray. So we have data from a lot of places, but it's only 3 years of data, and there are challenges related to the data. And so we can't use those 3 years reliably to make a trend detection. And that's why when you look at the San Juans, you see so many gray dots, because we just can't make a reliable trend. We are able, through indigenous scientific knowledge that we'll talk about next, and other scientific study, other Western science, to identify that the San Juans is an area of concern for losses. So we are able to use other information sources to inform our opinion about what's going on in the San Juans. However, we don't have enough quantitative data for trend detection at most of those locations.
Okay, thank you. So we are just about out of time for this section. We are going to take a 5-minute break, so we will reconvene at 10:50, and then we will move into our community engagement discussion. So 5 minutes, be back at 10:50, and we will keep moving along. Does the screen look okay, Helen?
I think the screen looks great. Would everyone else like to weigh in?
Just wanted to make sure the screen sharing was working. Okay, great. Thank you.
Looks good. Going great.
And in the meantime, I'm typing answers into to Etherpad. And I see Robin and Robin's students. So you all, there's a lot of gaps to be filled here. So you may find projects that you want to work on.
Elizabeth, if I blink out to go to another meeting briefly, will I be able to come back in using the same link?
Yep, I'll just keep an eye on the waiting room.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, it is 10:50, so we are going to keep moving into our next section, which, as I mentioned, we will be talking about community engagement. And for that, I'm going to hand it over to Nicole and Todd.
Buenos dias, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Does it sound good, Elizabeth?
Sounds great.
Okay. I am Nicole Nahr. I'm a social science and education specialist with Washington Sea Grant. And my colleague and I, Todd Woodard with the Samish Indian Nation, will be sharing some thoughts and reflections on community engagement with you all this morning. Next slide, please. So some of you may recall the 2021 Kelp expedition that was led by the Puget Sound Restoration Fund. And that was really the first opportunity that we had after the Kelp plan was released to really build momentum and support for kelp conservation and recovery. And developing this floating kelp canopy area indicator for the Puget Sound vital signs is, of course, the current, but certainly not the last opportunity to advance the Kelp plan. And central to the Kelp plan vision are some core values that the Vital Sign project team has been committed to incorporating into the indicator development process as well. So the first value I want to touch on is diverse participation. And really, by engaging many different perspectives, the idea is that we can increase the likelihood that our kelp conservation efforts reflect diverse social values and thus have social legitimacy and give ourselves a greater likelihood of success. So our project team itself is institutionally pretty diverse, and the indicator development process has really benefited from the diverse group of constituents who've participated in these public workshops and public comment periods. So a few examples of the constituents who've participated and been involved in one way or another. We've had engagement with tribes, with county planners, both federal and state managers, as well as scientists. We've heard from state parks and national sanctuaries, citizen science networks, NGOs, academics and students, and many different local residents in Washington state. Next slide, please. But we know that simply marking our workshop as open to the public, can we go back one or two slides? Thank you. It's probably not going to get us the diverse and meaningful engagement that we were looking for. So we engaged in some pretty intentional outreach to two groups in particular, citizen scientists and volunteers, and also tribes. So citizen scientists and volunteers have direct access to local governments and are really important for spreading the word about kelp and its importance within their communities. And the tribes are the original as well as ongoing stewards of the Salish Sea, and their traditional ecological knowledge and perspectives is an essential contribution to the kelp conservation and recovery strategy in Puget Sound. In a moment, my colleague Todd will share some examples of how members of these two groups in particular contributed to the project. But we know this isn't everyone, and we'd love to hear more from you all about which voices are still missing from these conversations and how we might best reach out to them to get them to help contribute to future iterations of the Vital Sign and other work surrounding the Kelp plan. And that last element of our vision is the co-production of knowledge. So encouraging diverse participation and including diverse perspectives makes this possible. We really want to sort of bust open those so-called silos of knowledge and really let folks both into as well as out of the ivory tower. Because when you're trying to make progress towards real world problems, it really requires us to grapple with the complexity of the real world. And because there are so many different ways of knowing that can enrich our understanding, inform our priorities, and inspire our actions. So our goal here has been to weave together diverse knowledges so that the indicator includes data and information from state agencies, citizen science, and Indigenous science. So next, my colleague Todd will share some really concrete examples of what this actually looked like in practice for vital sign development thus far. so that terms like transdisciplinary co-production of knowledge don't just sound like social justice word salad for the non-social scientists in the Zoom room. So take it away, Todd.
Excellent. Aisquachil, everybody. Good morning. My name is Todd Woodard, and I work for the Samish Indian Nation. And as part of the Natural Resources Department, we've been doing quite a bit of kelp research in the San Juans. And from the get-go on this team, as has been mentioned before, we really wanted to recognize that there is more data and other types of data out there than the Western science gathered quality assurance plan vouchered for Excel spreadsheets that we're so familiar with. So our goal was to really try and reach out and incorporate those different types of knowledge to enrich our understanding of the trends analysis and what's happening with kelp in our part of the Salish Sea. And so, we're very much trying to develop a metric by which a variety of data forms that can't necessarily be directly compared to each other are included in the assessments, and that type of knowledge is incorporated into those sub-basin assessments. And I'm going to give just a couple examples of the varied types of data that were incorporated into this process, and I'm really providing these not by way of proving that we did this, but also to get the creative juices flowing out there and get folks thinking about what data exists beyond our narrow Western scientific understanding that can be incorporated in future iterations of this indicator. So next slide, please. So we've talked a bit about the San Juans, and we looked at sort of the limitations of the regression style data that we have there. And I'm sure some folks might have been thinking, then why does it say insufficient data or no trend? Why are we saying concern? And the real reason there's concern is because we were able to incorporate the knowledge of over 100 years of fishing experience in the San Juans from indigenous scientific sources. And that resulted in this hand-drawn chart. And we were able to incorporate that data not necessarily just as an acreage to acreage comparison with what we're experiencing with our digitation of aerial photography data in the present day, but we can certainly look at areas and say, wow, folks remember vast areas of kelp here, and it's gone. So what's going on here? So again, it's utilizing that data to tell a more complete story. Next slide, please. Another example is down in the Beckett Point area. And these folks, and I know there are some folks that were, I think, attending this year. So if I misspeak, I apologize, and please clarify in the comments. But this is a group of long-term residents that has identified that there has been kelp in front of their residences over a long period of time, and that it's changing, and they're concerned about it, but it's an area that's not currently monitored. So this is another area where we're looking at those areas and saying, okay, this could be a data gap, and what limited knowledge we have can tell us that there may be concern and more focus needed on this area for future iterations. Next, please. And finally, by way of example, we've got a great combination of some very old historical mapping data along with current indigenous cultural concerns. And this area is at Point Jefferson, and there's this old map that exists that shows the kelp bed area mapped on it in that red circle there. And it is now gone, and it's an area that is of cultural importance to the Suquamish Nation. And so with no kelp there, and knowing that there was kelp there and that it's an important site to a group of people, DNR continues to monitor here for potential recovery. And it's also one of the Puget Sound Restoration Fund sites that they're actively looking to restore bull kelp here in their efforts to make that happen sound-wide. And so these are just three examples of some of the alternative or indigenous scientific knowledge data that we've been able to incorporate into this first iteration. And we hope that the framework we've created will allow and invite and encourage these types of data sources to be continued to be developed and integrated into future iterations. Next slide, and I believe that turns it back to Nicole.
Yes, thanks, Todd. So I do want to be a little bit honest and upfront about some of the challenges and constraints that we face with this project in really realizing our vision of doing transdisciplinary co-creation of knowledge. We're not all the way there yet, and we know that. True transdisciplinary integrated co-creation of knowledge is really an aspiration that will more likely be realized at the much longer timescale and broader scope of the Kelp plan as a whole. Next slide, please. And there are a few reasons why this has been the case. So first and foremost, we're not building something completely new or modifying something that already exists. So something like an indicator is really not set up to easily incorporate non-numerical knowledge, even though, as Todd mentioned, those forms of knowledge and information are really important for showing things like temporal depth and the sociocultural meaning and importance of kelp. So for something like the Puget Sound vital signs, internal consistency is a real priority. And so the indicator that we created really had to fit within this existing framework that has its own goals and objectives and processes and standards and requirements. So what that really means is that co-design, that sort of first step in the process, was not part of our process for this particular project. A second reason is that we had a 2-year project timeline, and that really didn't allow for us to move at the speed of trust, which is really important for forging meaningful relationships among diverse partners and for having those tough conversations in order to reconcile differences between perspectives and approaches. Next slide, please. But despite these challenges, we did have a real opportunity to strive for the co-production piece, sort of this middle part, by synthesizing different sources of data information. And we also hope that we have, with this approach, laid the groundwork for the next iteration of this cycle, it is a cycle, so that it does include both co-design and co-production for future projects related to the Kelp plan, and so that it does move us closer to that vision that I outlined a few slides back. Next slide, please. And finally, I think there have been some real benefits to working within that existing Puget Sound Partnership's vital sign framework. It's well known and widely recognized within the state, which really helps increase visibility and amplify communication around kelp conservation and recovery. And we hope that our intentional approach to community engagement that we really strive to implement here while developing the floating kelp canopy area indicator will help make the vital sign program itself a bit more inclusive and participatory and transdisciplinary. Next slide, please. So as we've said, the indicator is composed of annual bed area on long-term trends at 172 locations from primarily 3 groups: the Samish, Northwest Straits, MRCs, and DNR. Next slide, please. Other information sources are incorporated into sub-basin status assessments, and this includes information from examples that Todd presented, like the San Juan Indigenous scientific knowledge, information from residents like those observed at Beckett Point, historical resources, and many scientific studies. Next, please. But what if someone wants to add a monitoring location? That's something we're very interested in hearing about. To add a monitoring location, we would need long-term spatial data that delineates bed area and monitoring protocols. And then we also need additional resources to help with quality assessment and control, interpreting the results, and updating and maintaining those products. So that's kind of on the numerical side of the data. But we also welcome continued contributions of other kinds of information that we can work into the indicator at some of those other levels. So please share with us. I hope that the examples that Todd shared sort of spark ideas about what kind of information can be incorporated into this project. And finally, the project team is creating an alliance for creators and users. It will be called the Kelp Forest Monitoring Alliance for Washington State. Next, please. So this draft logo at the bottom left there was created from artwork by Andrea Dingeldine, and she made the Puget Sound Kelp poster. She's in the meeting with us to get a better understanding of our community as we finalize the indicator, and she develops the final logo for the group. Next slide, please. So we really want to encourage participation in this broader project as we move forward. As Todd mentioned, this is really kind of an iterative process. It's not the end, it's really a beginning. We can think of the indicator as sort of this pyramid or set of nesting dolls where contributions might be most visible at different levels. And we really want to see this develop and incorporate more information in the future and improve going forward. So please keep providing us or start providing us with those spatial and numerical data sets that we can work into the high-level vital sign. Reach out if you want assistance starting a new long-term monitoring site. Keep sharing the other kinds of information with us that will add to the broader monitoring and conservation effort that indicator development is nested within. So in the midterm, there's opportunities to get involved with the Kelp plan. I think Jeff Whitty from Northwest Straits is in the room, who's the Kelp plan coordinator. There's also the marine vegetation implementation strategy that Elizabeth Spalding at DNR is leading. And keep your eyes and ears open for opportunities to engage on the kelp and eelgrass health plan that DNR is also working on. And in the longer term, we really want to link monitoring to conservation action and really highlight the ways in which kelp is linked to the broader social and ecological well-being of Puget Sound and Washington State as a whole. Next slide, please. So thanks. And I think now we have some time for questions and discussion that Elizabeth will facilitate.
Thank you, Nicole. So we're going to use the same process. We do have the Etherpad up and running, but we'd also welcome questions with your raised hand. So questions or comments around what you've just heard around our community engagement processes and goals for the development of this tool.
So Elizabeth, I'd like to jump in and answer one of the questions that's on Etherpad.
Okay.
That we've had a series of questions. One of them was, have you reached out to non-treaty tribes?
Helen, real quick, maybe adjust your microphone because it's a little bit.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, much better.
So there are a series of questions in Etherpads about who we've reached out to and how we reached out to non-treaty tribes. We've made every effort we can to reach out to everyone we can, and part of reaching out is this meeting. So please, anyone who's interested, send us an email. Our main email collector is nearshore@dnr.wa.gov. And we have small meetings with many people. And we would love to have small meetings with, you could be a resident, you could be a, whatever. We're interested in connecting with people who are interested in floating kelp. So if we missed you, we're sorry, and let us know.
Thank you. So we do have a couple of hands up. Let's start with Betsy and then we'll go to Hugo.
Thanks. I was just wondering if there's any way of trying to compile photos, historic photos, just from families or, people. I know there's probably a bunch of people just looking out their window and have pictures of sunsets or whatever that may be able to include just over the years, any images that they've taken, like from Beckett Point or Diamond Point or the Miller Peninsula. Just wondering.
Yeah, I think there's some real opportunities for maybe doing some historical ecology that brings in sort of that long-term, could be historical archives, or as you mentioned, sort of like photos taken in place over time. You could also pair that with sort of oral histories that are geared at trying to get at long-term trends and how things have changed over time. That kind of research, I think, is really useful for clarifying like how baselines have shifted. So yeah, I think that's like a really cool sort of opportunity for a project that could fit into the broader Kelp plan.
Yeah, and if I could chime in, I know the data heads and the statistics people are freaking out right now, because how do you determine what time all those photos were taken, what tide level, et cetera. But I think that's a really good example of how we're trying to create a framework that allows for both data that can be statistically analyzed, but also within the summary reports include information such as that's more observational and honestly sort of more real life of folks and their experience with kelp. So I think, yeah, I think we've tried to deliberately leave openings for exactly that kind of data.
Yeah, I think that's like a kind of a way I've described it is sort of the numerical data kind of provides a black and white picture, or sort of like the bare bones, and sort of the historical context, the ethnographic contents that gives you the color, that provides sort of the flesh around those bones, and I think is really useful for motivating people around kelp conservation and recovery.
Okay, we'll go to Hugo.
I'll add one last thing, which is we have done historical ecology studies such as that in South and Central Puget Sound, using whatever we could find, whatever data we could find. And it's been really useful for documenting changes over time. It did show us, just to quickly summarize that work, that DNR led massive losses in South and Central Puget Sound and general century scale stability. And this is from work with Kathy Pfister, who's here, along the Strait of Juan de Fuca in general, with perhaps losses on the Eastern Straits. So that historical data really does a good job of backing up our general impressions. And we love it if people do it. It takes forever. And I do it. I love it.
Okay, so we're going to go to Hugo and then Bob.
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth, and Nicole and Todd. Thank you for your presentation. And I was just wondering if part of your project also could reach out to community development and planning departments for local governments. I know that a lot of people use that kind of planning and as a source of information for conservation. So I was wondering if you are planning to do something like that.
I think that's a great question and a great suggestion, Hugo. I think it touches on a question that is in the Etherpad already about sort of how these vital sign resources might be leveraged to broaden or deepen community engagement going forward. So there's plenty of directions to go in that. I think the idea of reaching out to county planners is a good one, or taking us on a roadshow. I've heard of other sort of projects. I think those are more focused on resilience and climate change adaptation, but maybe like going into local bars or restaurants or churches and showing folks some of the like beautiful short documentaries that have been developed around kelp in Puget Sound, and introducing them to this tool, and looking at their specific region and seeing, you know, is your community and the kelp nearby already being monitored or not, and kind of engaging folks that way as an idea, or maybe creating educational resources that get students involved with using and looking at some of this data are some ideas moving forward for that. But love to hear other suggestions from folks in the group.
Yeah, and I'd agree, Hugo. I sort of, you know, being on the more closer to the kelp research and restoration practitioner side of this whole picture, I kind of view the indicator as a tool for the kelp community to use to help leverage building partnerships and securing funding. You know, this is, you know, the sort of this bringing it up to the partnership level, and having this out there as part of the action plan and the indicator wheel. Should allow folks to really bring some focus in on their local areas and gain support and hopefully funding to do something, to take action is sort of the hope. So.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to add one last thought to that conversation, which is that the indicator is a really small, limited thing. And, you know, some of us, we spend our lives just on that one small part, but there's so many linked pieces here that, and I think what we're hoping to do here is make sure that those linkages are explicit. So one of the great things about having Jeff Whitty here, for instance, is we've got representation from the Kelp plan that can knit together these limited indicator projects with other work. Also, we have Habitat Strategic Initiative representatives, Elizabeth Paulding, DNR Health and Conservation Plan reps, Max Showalter and Cynthia Harbison are here. So what we're hoping is that we're casting a wide enough net that these that someone can pick up and address these really important questions that might not be directly within the indicator project itself.
Thank you. Bob, we'll hand it to you.
All right. So I'm Bob Simmons. I work with Washington State University Extension. And I wanted to mention that we have a program that was really active in the past 2 decades. It's not so active now because of funding, but it's called Shore Stewards, where we've engaged shoreline residents into following guidelines to better protect their marine ecosystem from impacts from their living along the shorelines. We still maintain a quarterly newsletter with about 2,000 subscribers from that program. So that might be a great opportunity to reach out about this Kelp project. So I invite that. If you were able to have a brief article with links, that would be engaging for folks to follow. And, and even maybe point out if they had historic data that, their grandparents used to talk about, there's always kelp beds here and now they're gone. Is there a mechanism to report that, to who do they reach out to? So that would be good to include in that. We could also put something on our Shore Stewards website through WSU, which, believe it or not, we don't really market it, but it gets between 800 and 1,000 hits a month, according to analytics. So a lot of people are just kind of sussing out information and want to get involved and look to that site. So we could put something there too. But lastly, my real question is, so what if my grandpa said, hey, there used to be beds here, but they're not here anymore? Like, who would he report that to, and how?
Who would like to take that question? Is that a Nicole or maybe a Helen?
I think there's like a spectrum of like how what you want to get done with that information, how formal it would be. Like, I think there could be really cool like student projects, for example, that collect that information from within a community and present it. I'll defer to Helen on like who at DNR maybe would be, or at other state agencies perhaps might be the best audience for that information.
The short answer for DNR is nearshore@dnr.wa.gov, which is me or one of the other people you see in one of these little boxes. So it's just a central place that we could get emails to. And what we will do is, we really do think about all of the observations we hear about. The thing is that, this is a statewide indicator. And so there's a limit to how much we can do. And so what we encourage people also is if you can do it yourself locally, it's going to be far more powerful and effective. So, and so for instance, there are Western Washington students here, or someone in your community or your MRC. If you could start to build that, if you can use the, if you can think about the data and make it useful to yourselves, that's the best thing you can possibly do. And I'll give an example. I don't know if Jeff Taylor's here, but we monitor a stretch of shoreline between McCurdy Point and Port Townsend. And he's concerned about an area within our monitoring location. Our monitoring location says stable over 30 years, but he's worried about an area within it. And so in cases like that, we're really interested in talking to him, and it would be really useful for him to work with his local MRC, perhaps put a monitoring site there, perhaps do some underwater video work through his MRC to look at the habitat more. So yeah, so that's the short answer is it's talk to us. We would love to hear about it, but also anything that comes up from your community will be more powerful. And I also will, I'm not sure if Dana Oster is here. I'm not sure. she might also have something to add as someone who organizes the MRCs. But Bob, tell me where is this site? Because where you are really matters to who you talk to.
Oh, yeah, that was fictitious. I don't have a grandfather that lives on Puget Sound.
Oh, you made that up.
Part of the Jefferson MRC, and I know Jeff well, who's part of the MRC. But I just, throwing it out there because we have all these shore storages. I mean, 2,000 of them that may have some information that might be valuable to you all.
I think there are lots of ways to use that kind of information. Like you mentioned, there's some students in the room, capstone projects. Students have created really amazing story maps that use sort of like visual and oral history to really sort of add that color vision to conservation priorities. I've also heard of sort of local exhibits, sort of show like, maybe displays in the library or in a like central spot in a community, sort of highlighting those photos, historical photos that folks might. So I think there's like a lot of really different interesting ways to go, different directions to go in with including that kind of information in the broader Kelp plan.
Yeah, and I'd like to just chime in, something I got really excited about just during the course of this meeting was when the local Skagit MRC person was realizing, hey, we need more sites up in Whatcom. And knowing the local Skagit MRC as I do, I can already see partnerships forming to share methods and getting the Whatcom MRC involved. And all of a sudden we may have 30 sites running up there. So, that's the kind of thing that we hope that this indicator will foster, as well as those kind of, let's start exploring partnerships and where can folks contribute. And then future iterations will become far more complete.
That is a good idea. I mean, all of what you're saying. And, our local Marine Science Center that Betsy, who's representing that here today, they have a new kelp exhibit. And boy, it'd be great to engage some information collection from area residents about where there used to be beds and where the beds are now, based on the data that has been, collected scientifically as well as through the community. So these are good ideas, and maybe our MRC will take a project like this on.
So I see we have one more hand up. We are at time. So Natalie, if you could be quick with your question, and we'll try to be quick with our response before we move into our last section of the workshop today.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I will be. Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie. I'm the lead for the Vital Signs Reporting Program at the partnership. And first want to thank the project team for such an exciting and wonderful project. And I particularly appreciate this section about community engagement, trying to weave in these different forms of knowledge and sciences into the indicator. I really see you all as like a role model for many of our other indicators that are under the vital signs. I just want to add, so glad we're thinking about the vital signs as to leverage those as a resource for advancing the work. That is like one of the goals of the vital signs. They are a communication tool first and foremost, and seem to infiltrate in different areas. I just want to put a plug in, for some like linked resources. Obviously there's the action agenda or plan for recovery, but there just our board system. So for instance, Helen and her team are going to our science panel board next month to talk about this project and the importance of kelp recovery. And then another resource, and this last thing I was going to say, is our lead integrating organizations. These are locally based organizations supported by the partnership. And the whole function is to contribute at the local level to the protection and the recovery of Puget Sound. So for folks that are thinking more about their backyards, or they want to link kelp to conservation actions in their local areas, that find out who your LIO is, or lead integrating organization, and bring kelp to their attention. And the great thing about this project is because the data are sliced and diced at the sub-basin level, you do have information on not just at the scale of Puget Sound, but at these more localized scales. So there are data there to communicate, or results to communicate.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Last comments from the project team before we move on to our third section. Okay, let me get our slideshow back up then. How does that look for everyone? Great. Okay, so we are going to move on to priorities for enhancement.
All right, thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks for everyone for staying with us. So for this final section, we want to think about how we can grow and enhance the project moving forward. So as we've kind of already mentioned, this first draft of the indicator, we've built a framework as an initial product, and it was developed fairly rapidly using as much existing data as we can. And we recognize that enhancements are needed. And these fall into two broad categories. First is prioritizing additional detailed products. We see this as a relatively manageable task. But the other big category is addressing the myriad of data limitations, as we've kind of already touched on. And this is a much larger multi-year task. Next slide. So let's focus on what detailed products are priorities to work on, assuming we have the resources to build them. So we've already talked about subbasin and monitoring location summaries of existing data. So these are those pages that Helen showed on the interactive map when you click on a location. These are relatively easy to create, and we feel that they provide a lot of useful information in an accessible way. And we envision that these will be updated periodically as new data becomes available. Next slide. However, other more detailed products is a little more uncertain. Subbasin reports, which we've alluded to, provide a lot of detail on the data and status and trends of floating kelp in a subbasin. However, they're quite time consuming to create, and updating these annually would be a substantial task. Similarly, other summaries of other data and research could provide a lot of value to indicator products, but would require dedicated time and effort. So a question for all of you today, and as you continue to review the draft indicator in the coming weeks, is first, are these types of products useful? And should they be a priority if resources allow? And so we've provided a draft subbasin report of the San Juan Islands. A link to that is at the top of the Etherpad. And we suggest that you take a look at it and keep this in mind as you review the information that's there. And you know, with an eye to this is a lot more detail and can be useful, but it takes a lot of time and effort to create. Next slide, and I'll pass it to Helen to talk about other enhancements.
So thanks, Wendell. So there are two ways you can look at this initial indicator we're showing you. First of all, we can be very excited because we have a framework and we have initial data, and that's important. And you know, I think I can speak for all of us to say that we're really excited to be where we are. The other way to look at it, which is completely true, is that there are major gaps in this indicator and there are major enhancement needs. And these are summarized in the monitoring program design document. And what we'll do here is just briefly lump them into some big buckets for you to think about more. First of all, the biggest need is to fill gaps in the monitoring data. And as you remember, looking at the subbasin status, 4 out of the 11 subbasins don't even have sufficient data for a definitive classification. So that's a problem. And that's where we really need to focus some of our increased monitoring work. And we can both expand ongoing monitoring and also integrate historical data sets to increase our state of knowledge and to really fill out this map. The other thing we need to do, which is linked, is enhance and expand the parameters that are measured. And we talked today about we're using bed area because it's the most, it has the most data. But, canopy area is important. Looking at abundance, be it density or cover or biomass, looking at depth distribution. There's so many other secondary parameters that we need to add over time to really make the indicator more informative. Now, there are I want to briefly mention some projects. We're doing some pilot work to start to fill gaps and enhance and expand parameters. The problem here is that all of the work I'm about to discuss is not funded beyond sort of short-term pilot work. So I want to be very realistic about, Eleanor Hines just entered into the chat about the Whatcom MRC is maxed out. And, many of us are maxed out given available resources. So we're trying to be very careful about doing some pilot work and figuring out and finding funding for what we need. One exciting thing, very exciting thing, in 2022, we collected aerial imagery, low tide, as low tide as we could, as slack current as we could for many of these northern areas. And that's we DNR, and we will be classifying that. There's also a lot of work with drone imagery that's going on. And that's really important in areas with low density or small sites, because aerial photography works best in areas with big dense beds. And then as Nicole and Todd talked about a lot, we really value other information sources of every kind if people want to provide them. And also it's possible to add additional monitoring locations if we could figure out a structure for how to do that. And two people who are thinking about that a lot are Bianca Perla at the Vashon Nature Center, who may be here. She was going to try to join. And Jason Toft and Simone DeRoche at University of Washington. So those are two examples of a group, Vashon Nature Center, that wants to start adding a monitoring site, and a group of scientists, the Shoreline Monitoring Database with Jason and Simone, who might be able to step up and also find resources to provide expertise to help individual participants add their monitoring sites. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, add it to the Etherpad or send us an email. Okay, so two other really major areas of enhancement are we need to further develop this monitoring framework. We have a hierarchy of geographic assessment areas that you can read about in the monitoring program design. It's only partially implemented. We really need to attach physical attributes, either through sampling or through other data sources, characterization, to our different geographical assessment areas so we can start to understand conditions that are linked to the trends we're seeing. And then finally, if we can't monitor comprehensively, which we probably won't have enough money to do, we're going to have to pick some core annual monitoring locations. So, and then finally, we need to explore linkages to other research, which will really help us to inform interpretation of results. For those of you who are interested, oh, next slide, sorry. Thanks, Wendell. Next slide. Sorry, I'm looking at, I can't see well. Then we have proposed a technical review by the British Columbia Washington Kelp Node Work Group. And so for those of you who want to get involved at a technical level, that we'll be doing a review of the monitoring design with them sometime in the summertime period. Next slide. And then the last thing I'd like to say is that as we've talked about, this meeting is centered around the indicator project, and the indicator project is important, but it actually has a fairly limited scope relative to everything we care about in the Kelp plan, and we care about Kelp. So for instance, a lot of stressor research is going to occur through academic institutions, like some great work going on by UW right now. And then policy review, other groups are doing that. There's a wonderful Pew study. Puget Sound Restoration Fund is doing really important work. And so Habitat Strategic Initiative also. So all of these different groups are doing different pieces. And so a lot of the things we hear today and we hear about, we're trying to coordinate with these other groups to make sure they happen to the greatest degree that's possible. Next slide.
Okay, our final round of discussion. So at this point, I think you know what to expect. Let's go ahead and we can raise hands, or we can also pull questions from our Etherpad. And if there's anything the project team wants to pick out specifically to get us started, feel free to do that. Tom, I see your hand up.
Hi, number one of the questions that came up in this was the issue about urchins and the relationship of urchins to kelp. And I just want to, this is a big general question here that will come up. And do you want to do that now, or do you want to wait a bit to sort of do the general questions?
Let's see if there are any questions specific to what we've just heard, and then we'll circle back.
Yes.
Yeah.
That I'll fine. Let's do that.
Okay. So if there are questions or comments around, these priorities for enhancement, now is a great time to have that conversation. But as Tom just alluded to, we do also want to open it up for any last general questions or comments about what you heard today before we wrap up. Tom, I'm going to let you take the floor while others percolate on some of these other questions.
Okay, real quickly, that's an absolutely fascinating question. And there's a bunch of people, Kathy Pfister and others are here on this as well. The world of sort of the relationship of kelp to urchins, to herbivores, and sort of these trophic cascade food web interactions is exploding right now with people looking at this. And it's something that's really important because it shows that this kelp, how is kelp interacting in an ecosystem as a food source, as also as habitat. And it gets into the why we care issue very much. People like Paul Chitaro is here talking about how much kelp is consumed by crabs and rockfish. And it turns out to be a huge amount. And so all these connections are really important. So when we talk about how we use these data that we're doing here, how we are thinking about what happens if you lose all this kelp, these are the connections that we need to be really cognizant of about this. And it gets real time. In Southern California, there was an urchin fishery and an abalone fishery that was pretty much gone because the kelp disappeared. So there's some direct human impacts to this, as well as sort of ecosystem impacts.
Thanks, Tom. So I see there's quite a bit of conversation occurring in the Etherpad, and that is fantastic. But I do also want to open it up for anyone who would rather voice their question or comment. Feel free to do so.
Okay, so I'm going to bite the bullet and repeat a question that's in the chat that is incredibly hard. And whoever wrote it, it's wonderful and it's torture. Is it possible or feasible to identify long-term targets, goals, and metrics for the health of kelp? And I'd like to, that's the question, and I'd like to have the project team or anyone else who thinks it'd be fun to talk about that incredibly complex question that we talk about a lot.
Repeat it one more time, Helen.
Is it possible or feasible to identify long-term targets, goals, and metrics for the health of kelp?
I could maybe start things off by, and what's great about the interactive map, which really helps illustrate this, is, and this is really evident in places where we have long-term data, like the Eastern and Western Strait. There is a huge amount of year-to-year variability in the kelp out there. And so if you're on the map or want to go to it later, just click one of those dots, like out by Port Angeles or Nia Bay, and pretty much without fail, there's just huge variability year to year, and especially like across decades. And so just that feature of the data alone, and try to step back and say, well, okay, what's normal here? That's a very hard question to answer, just kind of from a data-driven perspective alone. That's been a really illuminating part of this project, and a huge benefit of the interactive map. It makes that looking at the data in that way so much easier. So I think that there could be a problem, or it could be challenging to set a target for a specific location or subbasin if we don't have many years of data. Because even with 30 years of data, which, you know, that seems like a long time, you're looking at a lot of those of that data. It's like, well, what's normal here? Like, is it the long-term average, or is it going up or going down, or is it going to change in the next 10 years? Yes or no?
So I see Tom and then Todd.
Get turned back on again. Natalie, you might have some thoughts on this. This target setting thing is just an incredibly complicated business. For me, I think it as a social question. It's not necessarily or just a scientific thing that can be answered by scientists. What do people want in terms of ecosystem goods and services from kelp, let's say? What kind of fisheries are supported? What kind of cultural resources are being supported, so forth and et cetera? That is not a decision that the scientists make by themselves. And that's where it gets really, really complicated. Whether you can get there or not, maybe is more of a science question, but what you want to get to is much more than that. And will engage everybody, not just scientists, if you will, in this exercise. That's my 2 cents worth on that.
Thanks, Tom. Let's go to Todd.
Tom, I'll send you the $10 for that segue. That's brilliant. Because what I was going to comment on is, sort of the discrete, measurable goal of recovery of X acres of kelp. That's not what we tend to really focus on, at least here at Samish. In our work to identify trends in the San Juans, it's always been about, if you don't turn that data into information and then into action, you've just got a bunch of numbers. And so we're super excited that our data is included in this effort to create information. But our end goal is really to look at, where has kelp disappeared? What can we do to hopefully restore and recover it and preserve what's left? And that's not just because of, it's certainly because of the ecological keystone nature of kelp forests, but also because of the cultural keystone aspects of this habitat. And when I say that, what I mean is, kelp is utilized for cultural resources by Samish and other Coast Salish people. Kelp is utilized by JPOD for social interactions, and the people I work for consider members of JPOD relatives, not just charismatic megafauna. And so, for us at Samish DNR, our entire mandate is to protect, enhance, and restore culturally relevant species and their habitats for current and future generations. So for our work, it always links back to that cultural tradition, passing on traditions, and what the choices we make today and how they're going to affect 7 generations from now, which is 5 grapes in front of my grandkids, for those of us that think more Western. And that's just sort of mind-blowing when you sort of think that long term. So I think, yeah, it's critical that we set a goal for understanding, but the end goal should be fixing and restoring and taking action.
Thanks, Todd. Other questions? Or project team, if there's anything standing out in this robust Etherpad discussion that you want to call attention to.
I'd like to tee up one more really great. Etherpad's full. I can tell a lot of people are typing, which is wonderful. And I want to read another one, because this is another one that's a killer and really good. Have there been any studies to correlate stormwater pollution outfall monitoring with health of kelp beds? For example, City of Anacortes has volunteer stormwater teams monitoring outfalls at shorelines around the city. There may be useful data that can be considered for nearby kelp health. I was wondering if we could talk about, and Megan, we might put you on the spot or someone else, but talk about two things. One, the broad topic of water quality. And second, how we might think about that. And I called on Megan for UW, but really there's a huge community component too, and a water quality monitoring component. So it may be unfair to just call on Megan.
I'm happy to be called on, but I am not quite sure what the question is.
The question is, have there ever been any studies to correlate stormwater pollution with health of kelp?
Oh, well, yeah, that's a really good
could-
question. Not that I know of. Yeah.
I see we've got hands
least
up
not in
first
this-
by- Okay, Nicole.
Sorry.
I just want to pivot briefly back to some of Todd's comments, which reminded me of some very early conversations you and I had about the value of creating some sort of conceptual model for helping to package and organize sort of what the Kelp plan is doing. Maybe some folks in the room are familiar with the big literature review on drivers and pressures that were influencing the state of bull kelp in the Salish Sea that was led by Jordan Haller-Smith, who's now with the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. So that was kind of embedded in the DIPSR framework, the drivers, pressures, state, impact, response model. And I think a lot of folks tend to think of, yeah, humans play a role in the drivers and the pressure side. But I think some of the things that Todd really spoke to about, figuring out what the impacts are, like impacts to what and impacts to whom, not just sort of considering the ecological impacts, but also the cultural impacts and on what timescale are really important to thinking about what the appropriate responses should be, that sort of last R. So I think we maybe still have some work to do around sort of fleshing out, or this I think is really focused on the state. What is the state of kelp, given the data sets that we have available, the information we have available, but sort of thinking about those next steps, I think are important pieces to sort of move this whole thing along.
Okay, Tom, we have 3 minutes before we have to move into our wrap up. So I'm going to hand it to you.
No, I was just going to go back around on the question that Megan sort of, I think she answered the question, what kind of work has been done on other kind of contaminants with kelp? And the answer is, in my opinion too, Megan, is not much. And which brings up the topic that we're beginning to get our heads around temperature and nutrient effects, and some of the work that's being done at Friday Harbor has really gotten us far down that road. But what about hydrocarbons? What about metals? What about sedimentation effects and those sorts of things here in Puget Sound? And I would offer not much, which brings up the topic that in order to look at kelp conservation and restoration, it's not just DNR, but it involves fisheries, it involves ecology with water quality issues. All these different facets need to be brought together in one complete package. I'll step off my soapbox.
Just a quick add, and I think that's when we look at the action agenda and the indicator wheel, there's an aspect of that almost by its nature and its presentation forces us into silos, right? There's a lot of stuff on stormwater, but there's not necessarily the explicit then relationship to kelp or to cultural well-being or to some of the other aspects. And I think that's, it's hard because, I'm not suggesting I know a better way to portray all that information. I think the indicator wheel is excellent. But I think it's something that we all need to be aware of, is that by our very nature, we tend to silo and focus. And the only way we're going to get a big picture is to consciously force ourselves outward and be open to new information and new partnerships.
And I'm going to switch roles here very quickly from facilitator to project team member, and just mention that there are these various efforts, as Helen has already spoken to, where we are trying to integrate some of that additional context and really work with some of those other agencies and those other strategic initiatives. So for example, building connections with the Stormwater Strategic Initiative so that we can look at marine water quality and try to find those opportunities to build some coordination and some collaboration there so that we can, make sure that we're looking at how those two things interact and how we can build logic models and projects that support both objectives. So there is an opportunity there, I think, to help inform that work.
And I'd like to add in also, if you look in Etherpad, I said this, Cynthia Harbison and Max Showalter have added a link to our kickoff workshop on its forest and eelgrass meadow conservation efforts. And so you can check in the bottom of the Etherpad for that. But there's a lot going on that hopefully we can meet all of these different goals that we have by linking these efforts together. So that's another opportunity to work on the next step, which is really the conservation portion.
Yep. And I'll have Cynthia Harbison, the health plan author, go ahead and put that link in the main chat because I know the Ethernet's getting very busy. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that, just look at the Zoom chat and she'll put some context in there. So for the sake of time, we do need to move into our wrap up. So I'm going to screen share one last time and hand it over to you, Helen, and then Tom, I believe.
This is all Tom. Go Tom.
This is all Tom.
And that's me, isn't it? Okay. Wow, I keep talking here. Well, first of all, thank you. This has been absolutely a delightful conversation and presentation today. I want to thank all the team that put this together, and I also want to thank all the people that participated here. It's been really good. So as I think we've discussed a lot here today, contact us about more discussion, more information. This is an open, ongoing process here. We're not closing the door at all. It's just we're opening the door, if you will, on all this. So please, all of you, you've all probably got some issue or niche or something that you can either help with and so forth. That's what we need to be working on. Comments, we can get comments here through the Nearshore link here through March 15th. So it can be in writing, it can be phone calls, it can be small group meetings, however you want to go about doing this thing. I heard kind of two big things. One was just cogeneration and how do we work towards more cogeneration, which is, I think, a big issue here. And a lot of people are very interested in that. How do we build this data? Then the second part to me is that engenders this community engagement. And the community engagement, I think, is really important here. How do we get people to care? And that is as important probably as the information, is the actual caring about all this thing. And clearly, this is all going to regard communication. How do we all talk to one another? As you can see, this is getting to be a very large and complicated effort. And how we go about doing this thing is going to be important. And then, as we've talked about here in several times, how are we going to use this information? Where is it going to go? Who's going to use it for what? And that feedback loop between the users and the people that are generating the information is going to be part of this as well. Conservation, restoration, all these sorts of things are all linked together here. So it's really going to be fun. And I'm really, again, thank you all. So to wrap this up, let's get down to the reward. How many people are still here? Let me look. We got 96 people on board still, according to this. So I have here a kelp basket. For those of you who haven't seen kelp baskets, you can take the dried stipes and hold fast and so forth and make kelp baskets. In that, I got little slips of paper, and I'm going to, with everybody's name on it, except for the team members here, which I think are ineligible for this thing. And I'm going to pull one out, and you have to be present to win. If you're not here, we'll draw another name out. So I have here Max Calloway.
Is Max here?
Is
He's
Max
not shy,
about?
so I know he would have spoken up if you were here.
Oh, Max.
Let me see if I can find him.
Lost in Port Angeles again.
Yep. All right, I think we have to pull another name.
Okay, here we go. Eeny, meeny, miny. Let's go. 1, 2, 3. Okay, Jeff Whitty.
Oop, Jeff, you still here?
There. Okay,
Jeff's
Jeff,
here.
I suspect you're here.
I am here.
You're there.
I would
All
never
right.
be.
So we'll figure out how to get this glorious print from Tim McClure to you. We'll work on this, okay? So again, thanks everybody. Call it quits. Time to go home. We're 5 minutes ahead of time. What do you want to do here? You got
Helen likes to
Helen
say,
says I'm out of here.
thank you, everyone. Yep.
All right. Thanks everybody. Take care.
Please make a
Wait, wait.
note, the first Zoom call in history to end 5 minutes early.
No.
So-
All right.
Thank you
All right.
so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.